my name is Beryl. I work here at the library. I'm going to introduce our speaker and we'll get going. Richard Etulain is the author or editor of 65 books, most of them which deal with the history and literature of the American West, the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the Basques. He was named president of both Western Literature and Western History Associations. He was raised in Eastern Washington and attended Northwest Nazarene College, now University in Nampa, Idaho, where he earned a BA in English and a BA in History. After, he gained master's and doctoral degrees in English and History at the University of Oregon. He taught at his alma mater, NNC, Idaho State University, and finished his teaching career at the University of New Mexico. He is here today to speak about Basque history and his latest book, Boyhood Among the Woolies.
When it gets so that you cannot see the screen because it is so full of sunshine and birds. Maybe my best ideas will come when it's blurred up here, right? So I'm going to have two parts. First part will be dealing with the overview of the Basque. And if you know your Basque history, I hope this will be a helpful overview. And unfortunately, those are going to be the lightest sorts of words. So I'm going to have to say the words because I don't think you'll be able to see them. But in the second half, I'll deal with my memoir. So there's two parts here. And I need to tell you that there are some things in my life that are non-Basque, and you need to know that. I never learned Spanish or Basque. Que lástima, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And my father married a non-Basque. So one of the reasons that I didn't learn a great deal about my Basque heritage early on, I was born in 1938, and the story in the second part is 1938 to 1949, the 11 years that I was on that sheep ranch. My father would say, "Tu busy." Now, if you don't understand that, that's busy in English. So that meant I didn't really get much of my Basque heritage at that time. And Washington Basques are in a different situation than Eastern Oregon, Idaho, Nevada. You're closer to other Basque groups here. We only had one sort of area where the Basques would come. That was Yakima, Washington. Not very many stayed there. We moved to Eastern Oregon, so we were Eastern Washington, so we were about 200 miles away from that one boarding house in Yakima. So it wasn't until I was in Nampa, and eventually for 8 or 9 years, that I began to sort of introduce myself to the Basque stuff in Boise. Then Americans in the 1960s became much more interested in ethnicity and race. And it was really interesting to watch my dad then to talk to me about being a sort of Basque. And in 1974, I applied for a National Endowment for the Humanities. Some of you have either helped with that or maybe had some help. I'm today traveling with the help of the humanities people. So I went to Reno to study. And if you have that sheet of paper, you look down to the name of the man who knows more about the Basque than any person in the world, and strangely enough, he's a non-Basque. His name is William Douglas. William Douglas. And the Basque Center in Reno is named after him, not after a Basque. So I had that opportunity to study for a year, and it was marvelous. And if you look at that same book, the co-author was John Bilbao, who had been a lot in the Boise area before he went to Reno. And I would say John is right up at the top too. He's now gone. I'm 85 years old, and Bill Douglas is 84. He's a young man yet. And so I hope he writes a lot more books. He's done about 20 worldwide kind of books. Well, that changed me. That changed me because I was an academic then. And so now I could put together an interest in my Basque background with my academics. An awful lot of people that are interested in Basque, it's because of their ethnic identity, not because they want to be scholars and to write books. That's okay too. And in fact, probably most of my information comes from non-scholars as I interview and talk to people. Okay, so let me start by giving you now the overview. I hope we can see enough of it that I can show you that. So about halfway through, I'll come to the memoir. You're not seeing that. That's the Jerry Echeverria book. And if you look down to her name, you see the name of the book is Home Away from Home. It's a wonderful book about Basque boarding houses. And this one we did a little bit later, and you see underneath her book, Home Away from Home, you see Echeverria and Etulain, portraits of Basques in the New World. And that's a series of biographical sketches. So, for example, there are about 3 Basques, Boise Basques, in that book. Do you know the name of Juan Achabo, or Juan or John? Now they say Archibald later on. He was one of the 2 Basques, I would say, who had more sheep and more acreage than any other people who were Basque in the Pacific Northwest. About 100,000 acres, about 100,000 sheep. Another man was in the state of Washington, and his name was Victor Lasames. And I would guess that was maybe French Basque rather than Spanish Basque, but I don't know that. Our ranch was good size. It was 10,000 acres, and our best crop was rocks. So I'll say some more about that a little bit later. Okay, let's see if we can get the very best of the Basque country image here. No, it's the best we're going to get. This is an old National Geographic, and here's the picture of the Basque in Spain, 4 provinces. The Basque up here in France, 3 provinces. And you, if you're Basque, have heard Zat Biat Bak. The 7 are together, or 1, 7 or 1. Now, when you go there, there isn't any border between us. You know that the new agreements in Europe have taken away a lot of the borders. The latest records, but this changes just about every year, it is said there are about 3 million Basques in this area, and about 2,400,000 probably came from Spain. Now, in the Boise area, most of the Basques are Biscayan. Biscayan Basque here? Okay. My dad came from Navarre over here, and there's interesting tension between the provinces, because during that terrible civil war that occurred in the end of the 20s, into the 30s, and even into the 40s, when Mr. Franco dictated and took over, the Basques, of course, were pushed down. But Navarre province went with the rascals. And that's because in the province of Navarre, there are more Spaniards than there are Basques. The population is about 5 to 2 or so. The Basques are in the northern part. In the southern part, you maybe have heard of the major city in Navarre is Pamplona. That's where that famous running of the bulls occurs. And the Boise Basques, for example, right now, have a wonderful display of Ernest Hemingway and the Basques, because he spent a lot of time in that area. Okay, I'm afraid this one's not going to show. This is a map from the National Geographic, and unfortunately, it is not going to show. But there's one big mistake, and you can't see it. This geography, that's the way of my writings, and that's the way with my wife. I hope she never sees the mistakes. Here's the map of the Pacific Northwest, and they put the Basque up there in Pendleton and up toward Walla Walla, and they should be, of course, in McDermott, Jordan Valley, and here, and Ontario. So in other words, you would say really central and southern part. But this guy here, this Eastern egghead, didn't know his Basque very well. Okay, you're not going to see the words at all in this one. So this is the beginning of what I'm going to say about the overview of the Basque. And I taught 22 years in New Mexico. This is the first Basque, sort of noteworthy. And if you can't see his name, right here, Juan de Oñate, 1598. So when you think about when did Basques start coming here? Like 1880s, 1890s. So just put your math together. That's 300 years earlier that the first Basque came to the Southwest, to the area before it's even United States. Now, because I've lived there 22 years, I need to tell you this story because it shows you how things can change over time. He was given the leadership of a territory. They didn't have states yet, and the Spain never did create states, so they were territories. So he was essentially the governor. Conflict, yes, all kinds of conflict between Native Americans and the Spanish coming in. And the Spanish wanted to control things, and they couldn't do it. So in this situation, if you've ever visited New Mexico, there are a lot of Native people. And one of the famous ones are the Pueblo people. And there are about 19 Pueblos. And one of the most interesting ones is a Pueblo that's up on top of a small little hill, mountain. It's called Acoma, Acoma, A-C-O-M-A. Well, there was a fight there. And gradually the Spanish won. Himself was not there, Oñate, but some of his relatives, some of his own children were there. It's going to help. Going to blind the eyes of some people, right? Okay. So what happens is, and we historians don't always agree on things. Amen there? Depends on whether we're Republicans or Democrats, huh? Or whether we're Oregonians or Washingtonians, or whether we're the West or in the East, whatever. It is said that in the defeating of those Pueblo Indians, the Spanish military cut off the leg of many Native American men. Tragedy. About 10 miles north of Santa Fe is a monument to him. But that goes way back. That monument was not done in the last 10 to 20 years. All of a sudden, and I was there in New Mexico when this happened, phone call comes from that little town to Albuquerque. Hey, they've cut the leg off of the monument of Juan de Oñate. It is said that the Native American and Pueblos got even. I don't know whether that's true or not. What I want to do is introduce the first Basque that comes and the controversies that were involved around it. This is not the sheep herder era. Most Pacific Northwest, including my own story, begins with sheep herders. But in other places, I'm trying to show you, it begins in another way. Now, this map shows you Mexico and up to California and up to the southern border of Oregon, because that was Spanish area. But in 1821, the Spanish are chased out. Who wins? The Mexicans. Mexico gets this area in 1821. So it changes from Spanish to Mexican control. And in 1848, what happens? The Americans win. Now, this next is a reason why you can't believe everything of what a historian says. Some historians say God decided that gold was not discovered until the United States got control in 49, so that the Mexicans didn't have the control. Now, I can see there's something happening here, so I think I better put on my beret so that I only tell the truth. Well, and unfortunately, you're not going to see this next one. And I list here about 10 people. Yeah, you're not going to see it. And they're all Basques, and they were all religious leaders, political leaders, government leaders, and many people don't know that there were still Basques, and this is the Mexican period, still in control and in leadership in California. And then that all changes in 1849 with the gold rush. A lot of Basques came, but they didn't come from Europe. They came from South America. Because the Basques have chosen the losing, no, they've been on the losing side of wars. And in the 19th century, they lost 2 major wars. And when that happened, they began, many of the men, to leave the country and go somewhere else where they could get rich. My dad would have said the same thing when he came in 1921, come to get rich. So many of them came to California, but they came later, and already other people had been there. And so they realized they couldn't get rich like they dreamed of. So, and I like these words, they decided to mine the miners. And so what they do is they provide foodstuffs. I would imagine a lot of those miners learned what barbecued lamb was, maybe, huh? Or old mutton, or whatever else they would got. And what that did is it established Basque ranchers and farmers in the sort of central part and the northeast corner of California. In the next decade, so in the 1870s, they begin to flood over into Nevada. And then, they come up here in the 1880s and 1890s. So there's the period from 1850 to about the 1890s that we finally then have most of the areas that are expanded here in the Pacific Northwest. Some were a little bit later than that. Let's begin with the history. If you go back, if we get back to that map, okay, right up here, you can see the corner, the front door of Spain is water, the Bay of Biscay. As early as the 4th century, Basques were whaling. I didn't know that there were whales in that area, but evidently there were a few. Then by the 16th and 17th centuries, they were whaling across the Atlantic. Now here's again where people argue, and so do historians. Were the Basques the first whalers to make it to the East Coast? Well, there's pretty good evidence that they were, if not the first, among the first, because there are several ships they've been able to find off the Newfoundland coast that have Basque stuff on them, so that they know that they were Basque. Well, that meant as early as the 1700s that the Basques were coming to the New World. Do you know that Columbus's ship was a Basque ship and that the captain was a Basque? So what that meant is it's just a natural thing. In fact, the story, not all wrong, but the mythic story, Basques are sheep herders. But you need to realize Basques were also seagoing people. They were fishermen. And so they got on the ocean, and so they were very much involved. They didn't do that here. So we know the American Western Basques primarily as sheep herder people. That's true too, but they were much more than that around the world. I'm not sure where we are. Okay, unfortunately, I wanted to show you that there was a development of some negativity, but I don't think we're going to be able to see it. Or I can't see it well enough. This one was in Nevada, and it goes something like this. These troublemaking, bloody Basques are here praising their country and getting us into trouble and putting us down. The date is 1898. What's happening in 1898? In Spanish-American War. So what these people were saying, and this is coming from Carson City, what these people are saying is the Basques are a part of the Spanish military. Not very true, not very true. But nonetheless, here are people who dislike Spain, so they're putting the Basques together. And I wish I could get this one, because this one is nasty. I can't give you the words, but it goes something like this. The Basques are clannish. Well, maybe put a few words in there that aren't in there. And they're innocent of thought, and their mode of living is on the level of Chinese. But they work hard and save their money. So there are about 7 bad things in the statement, but there's that one at the end. So maybe that journalist was rubbing his hands like that and he'd seen some bad. Okay, let's do a little bit with the sheep herders, because that's what you ought to think about when we see the Basques. Let's see if we get it. All right, there's a love story between sheep herders and dogs.
Right.
we had anywhere from 20 to 40 dogs. And we had 4 bands of sheep, and usually at least 5 dogs when we were around the home place. And when we went to the mountains, and we went to the mountains between Idaho and Montana, the Bitterroots up there in the northern part. And in the summer, we would live in St. Mary's, and then run the sheep anywhere from 30 to 50 miles east of that in the mountains. Well, when we would take all those dogs, you had to worry because the veteran dogs who had been there already knew how to handle bears. And the bears who had been hibernating were just coming out, and they love lamb more than Americans. So we always had trouble with the rookies, the ones who had no experience, because they go barking after the bear, and whack.
Yeah.
We'd lose 1 or 2. The veterans knew how to bark and jump back, bark and jump back. So we would usually lose anywhere from a third to a fourth of our dogs there. Now, and they were also orphan keepers. We called these bum lambs. And in our ranch, that was what the boys were supposed to take care of. And we'd get an old ketchup bottle, those big ones, not the small ones. Put a rubber nipple on the front and go out there, and those little lammies, it just hits. And by the way, if the lammies that we fed as bums turned into good little ewes, and then the next year or so, we kept them and they became mamas, they still would come to the back door of our house, gliding away for some of that good milk that they had. And of course, near all these places, boarding houses. And let me see here. The ones that I know a little bit about, the Oasis and the Plaza Hotel, okay? Urizar, is that the way you pronounce it? And the Star? Urizer, okay. So those were 2. But I've just written an essay on the Oregon Basques. And so I was writing some about the boarding houses in all places. What some of you don't know, I think, is how many Basques have moved to Portland. So the number there, you use these numbers at the bottom with caution. Here's why. Not because people lie, but because before 1980, there was nothing on the census that you could mark saying you were Basque. And an awful lot of people still don't mark the thing Basque. They do Spanish or French. So the numbers don't work very well. But I would say we're fairly close in saying that there's, and I can't get to 2020. I tried to get it from the census. Those rascals said, we don't keep such information. Well, where did this come from? This came from the census. But I would guess if you had natural stuff, somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500. Almost a third now are in the Portland area. Yeah. But it's very difficult for them to put together a Basque group, a club. And they had one for about 5 to 10 years and then collapsed. In those days, the Nampa was really encouraging a national North American Basque organization. And the only one in Oregon now is in Ontario. There are about 3 or 4 in the Boise area. There's one in Seattle. And I think somebody told me there's about 40 really around Canada and the United States. When I contacted people here in Burns, and it's probably not one of you, but I was told there was enough tension that it kept people from having an organized Basque club. Not that they didn't meet, but that they just, and the same thing happened in lots of different places. Here's one of the things that was tension over. Would you support the Basque activists or radicals in the Civil War? Or ETA later on, you know? And some people said yes, some people said no, and it brought some disunion. Generally speaking, the American Basques have not been that active in Spanish politics, but some were, so that brought some tension. So one of the changes that I'll come to in just a moment is we're in a post-Sheeper era. That sort of passed in the 50s and 60s. What are the Basques doing now? Well, it suggests, in one thing, they're going into urban areas. They're going to college. And so that has led them to different kinds of occupations than the farm and ranch that I grew up with. When I told my father, hey, Dad, I'm going to major in history and English. Oh, sonny boy, what are you going to do with history and English? 3 sons. He wants one to be a county extension agent, wants one to be a banker, and he wants one to be a veterinarian. See, very practical what he saw if he did education. Get something that he needed. History and English wasn't going to work for him. You know something? He paid my way through college. Yeah. Wait. By the way, I'm looking around to see if I see on any foreheads the best word I think for Basque. Indara or Indara. Indarra. It means perseverance, never stop, get it done. Or if you're an opponent of the Basque, pig-headed. So these were very, very important, the boarding houses. And you know, in many ways, they were marriage factories. Because almost all of the Basques came as single men. I'd say 80 to 90%. But quite often, sisters or other ladies that were known to them would come to work in the boarding houses. Guys would come in, fun, and marriage would occur. In some areas, not in Washington where I was raised, but in some areas, there were enough Basque girls that there was an easy Basque kind of marriage. I don't remember a single Basque in the state of Washington who married a Basque woman. There just weren't any Basque women in that area. Well, some of these guys were artists. This life is sad and bitter. And then he has his name here, and you can't read it, but it says Gore Escuscaldi. So it's like go Ducks or go Beavers. But it's go Basque. Okay, let's see here. Okay, we're going to say a little bit about Boise as a sort of a Basque center. And I think not too many people would disagree with me. In part, there are some places that are big, but I don't know if there's any sort of concentration. But here, again, just this week, I saw an article that said there were 20,000 Basques in Boise. Well, look at what it says on there. I think it says 7,000, doesn't it? The latest Idaho one? Yeah. For me, that's closer to the facts than somebody just say 20,000, thinking that's what it is. Nonetheless, many of those Idaho Basques are there in Boise, and so they've had a concentrated Basque group from early 1900s. This is the fellow that I mentioned, John Machado. Archibald, they changed it. Just like in the old country, my name would be Etulain. And Dad changed it to Etulain because it was easier, he thought, for Americans. But even in our family, we argue about whether it's Etulain or Etulain. So here's John Archibald, and he really he was a rich man. He was a very rich man. You've heard of the Sheepherders Ball that's in Boise that they have yearly. It's a big gathering. He was funding it, helping it to start. And mutual aid societies. Since you got single men coming to town, they had lots of needs, especially girls. But they also had mental challenges. We call it now mental health. Let me give you my dad's story. He said he'd never been away from the farm in northern Navarre more than 6 miles when he came age 19. In 1 week in the United States, he's out with 1,000 to 2,000 sheep. And he said, I got sheeped. And he said, I broke down and cried. Because it was so difficult for him to make that transition. And maybe you've had some things like that in your life. But what these did is they helped men quite often. We had medical needs, physical needs, food needs, and sometimes they even sent guys back to Spain who had some family needs. So this was a very good organization. Most of the Basque organizations have had something like it. And those famous Oankari dancers. Now this is an early one. They're all ladies, and most of them are older than the current members of Oankari. In 1964, we were in the World's Fair in New York, and it was wonderful to go to on the Idaho Day at the World's Fair, and it was the Owen card dancers that were focused. And they have been the calling card for an awful lot of Basques, and they are from Boise. Now it's young men and young women primarily, and they do a lot of travel. Now, you can't see it, but I'm going to call your attention. There are two signs here. This one says one way this way, and this one says one way this way. I like this because it might be saying, realistically, are the Basques going to be remaining Basques? They're going to become Americans. By the way, I'm a supporter of not either or, but both and. Were they both and? Or if you were an opponent, those muddle-headed Basques can't decide which direction they're going. And of course, there was always a cute little Basque, too. We call it attention. Now, my 18-year-old grandson loves coming to High Holiday. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened here recently. But when we saw all of those things that we saw in Boise, he said, Pop, so he calls me, what does this say about the Basques? I want you to think the same thing. I'm going to show you some more. And then in our discussion time, I'd like for you to tell me what you think Basques are. What is their identity? Okay, here's some more, and we're coming closer to the present. In 1959, just outside of Reno in Sparks, Nevada, the first national gathering of Basques. Now, that was really path-breaking because for the first time, a lot of Basques from Boise met Basques from Nevada. And they'd never met before. And by the way, do you know that when you leave Boise and go down toward California, there won't be as many Biscayans? I don't mean that there won't be any. It just means you don't have many French Basques in Idaho or in the Northwest. But you get increasing some and more Navarrese when you get into California. So what that meant is when you brought together in the national organization, it means that you brought together a lot of different Basques. I asked my dad one time, be prepared now for some negativity. Hey, Dad, what? Because I knew there was some tension between the various groups. He said, Dad, since he's Navarrese, I said, Dad, what about the Biscayans? Oh, they speak with mush in their mouth. What he was talking about is the difference in Basque dialects. They don't speak the same Basque in all of those provinces. There's quite a bit of difference. So, generically, Basque in this part of the world tend to be Biscayan, which is in the western part of the Basque country. And as you move more and more to the south and into California, there are more Basques. I'm not telling you they're even in the majority, but they're just more people from other provinces. And what would you see if you went there? Well, you'd see these hoop dancers. Wonderful part of the celebration when you went to a Basque festival. Or you would see the flag dances up here. Or you would see, and this is one of the interesting things that my grandson couldn't figure out, this guy chopping wood. Okay, now ask yourself, if you're going to do a celebration and the two things that you see men do most, this one and lifting a 250-pound stone. I think that guy went to a chiropractor the next day. But just think of that now. What is that saying? It's still being done. You go to High Alti, these are still central. So my grandson wanted to know what this was. And then there are the kids doing the patriotic or religious songs at the end. Again, what does this tell you about the Basque? Well, if I go forward, you can get it right. And now something new happened in the 1970s. University of Nevada, Reno started a Basque book series. Most of the Basques up till that time are not known as writers. Here's where you should start if you've never read a book about the Basque. This is an A+ book. And it introduces Robert Laxalt. It's there on that sheet of paper. I call it a novelized biography or novelized kind of autobiography. It's Robert Laxalt telling about the story of his father, Dominique. And here they are, Dominique over here. Lifetime sheepherder, really, and becomes the leading Basque writer. In fact, the Laxalt family is the best known Basque family in the United States. but you might know them better because his brother Paul became the governor and senator in Nevada. And I think we know politicians better than we know writers. So if I'm 85, I've only had a few months to become a politician. So it's a wonderful story because it is one of those themes. Going back for a visit. Now, my dad said, when I thought about coming, when he was 19, going to come and get rich and go back and marry a Basque girl. Now, he didn't say this next thing, but I'll add. Some people said, and no gold digging American woman. But what this does, and my dad went back once, and he was in his early 70s, so he's 50 years after he got he found him, and I think Mom was encouraging him in her way. That's my way of putting it. I think she was doing it like this. So it's a wonderful story, and if you like Robert Laxalt's writing, then I think you will. It is the way it was, and that it will always be. That's sort of the ending words of the book. And if you like his writing, here are 3 other of his books. The one on the left is called The Basque Hotel, and his wife, Dominic's wife, opened a boarding house in Carson City. It's called the French Hotel, so that novel is about that. This one is called The Child of the Holy Ghost. Most of us don't like to use naughty words. This is a Spanish way, using English words, of saying somebody is born without benefit of a marriage, but most people don't want to use the word bastard. So this is an interesting novel about how she was treated, the mom, Robert Laxalt's mom, as being the child of a non-marriage, and that there was so much pressure, she left the old country. And, it's not something she had anything to do with. It happened before her, but it's a novel about that. And this third one over here is about his governor, senator brother, Paul Laxalt. I would choose this one first, this one second, and this one third. So, Hotel, Child of the Holy Ghost, and then the one about his brother. Okay, we are now, 3 Basque politicians. And these deserve books. First one you ought to know about. Tony Uturi, the best known Basque politician in Oregon. And I would tell you, I'm a lifetime Democrat, but my ideal politician, the person I'm most attracted to, and you will see a book over here about him, is Mark Hatfield. Because I thought Mark Hatfield was a wonderful leader that you could trust. And I'm a lifetime evangelical, so that attracted me some to Mark Hatfield. When Mark Hatfield finished his 2 terms as governor, because that's all you could have, just like presidents only have 2 terms, it was said that Anthony Uturi was probably the logical candidate. He was born in Jordan Valley, but came out of Ontario, kind of. But he represented that area. After 2 years in the Idaho, in the Oregon legislature, in the Senate, he was chosen the Republican leader in 2 years. I don't know what's equivalent to a guy who throws 5 no-hitters or something. Anyway, when Hatfield retired, it was said that Uturi ought to be his replacement. And Uturi he liked that. Went to his doctor, the doctor said, told him, you'll commit suicide if you do that. You have heart problems, and that you ought not to do that. So he followed his doctor's advice, went back to Ontario, and was a lawyer, and helped the Basque people a great deal. Good person, very good person. We don't have a biography. And even more influential over a long period of time is Pete Setarusa in Idaho. Pete Setarusa had the office there, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, something like 40 years. Longer than any person that I know of in Western politics. And I was asking when I was in Boise, did he want to go up? It's a natural thing, either to go to governor or senator or something. She said, no, he just loved that. He was a very traditional Basque. He was a kind of quiet supporter of European Basques, more than other people. We need a biography. And here's Paul Laxall, and nobody has done him. I would add now to the list the Beeder family in Boise. So here are all these stories of political leaders, and we don't have a biography yet. I'm after the people in Boise to sponsor a series of Basque biographies. I hope they listen. I hope they say, bye, not as. Now, if you're an academic and you like academic work, start with this one. Those are the two guys that I studied with. Title of the book, Americanawac, means American Basque. And Douglas and Bilbao published this in 1975. Usually, you cannot say a book 50 years later is the best book. This is by far the best book. Part of it is, it's the world Basque. John Bilbao was a historian, so he did the early part of the history of the Basque country. And then they did South America, they did Mexico, and the last 100 pages are the United States. Now, Bill is an anthropologist. He's a more interpretive person. But the combination of that really made this book academic, and I would really recommend it. Now, if you're a general reader, I think I listed in that on there, don't they? Nancy Zubiri, Zubiri. Is it on there?
Yes.
Yeah. She's a journalist and a very good writer. Very good writer. She does some of the same things that Douglas and Bilbao did, but she focuses on the American West, takes you to each of the sort of communities. I'm sure that there's a section in there on Burns, but I just haven't looked at it recently. But there's some headlines in there, so it's a good book. Amen?
Yeah.
Backseat is telling me amen?
Oh, yes, amen. Yeah.
And there's a second edition of this in about 2004. And then she did a book on the high-altitude gatherings in Boise. She's a very good writer. I salute her. And, you know, I write academic books, but I write general books. When I had written about 20 or 30 years, and that's what I pleased my fellow academics, so I could go up, be promoted, and get some fellowships and that sort of thing. Then I said, I'll write for my wife and for my daughter. And then I wrote more general books. And this book that I've done on the Basque, my memoir, that's for a general audience. It's not for fellow academics. They would probably snoot their nose at it. Okay, let's come closer to the present. And these are contemporary images. We would go to, and you tell me if when you've had some gatherings here, has there ever been a Basque cookbook put together?
Yeah.
There has been, okay. And somebody said no, so let this gentleman know. He wants to know about that. So when I was here just recently, the Ontario people pointed to this one and said, that was theirs. Well, we have 10 or 15 Basque cookbooks on our shelves, but my Dutch wife does not cook Basque enough. So I come running in the door when I get back tomorrow. Paella, paella, paella. I think I will. Okay, we're at the end of the first part. And think about these questions. We don't going to talk about them right now, but think about them. Are Basques like other Americans? Are Basques changing over time? Why so little anti-Basque prejudice? And yet I gave you two examples of negativity. Do you know the words that were used most negatively widespread? I never heard them in Washington. I never heard them. But the most wide one, dirty black Basques. And that was a phrase used quite often when it was competition for grazing lands. And it especially was there up to the middle 1930s. After that, it tended to go away a little bit. In 1934, a famous legislative act, the Taylor Grazing Act, was passed. And what it said, and there were a lot of Basques who didn't own land, and they grazed their sheep on public land. So whoever got there first got the grass. And you know enough about sheep. If they're too much in one place, there's not much grass in there. Yeah, we thought that as cattlemen too. We had to be very careful not to put the sheep first into a place where the cattle were coming, because there wasn't much left. Well, the Taylor Grazing Act said this: you cannot go onto the public grazing areas, and this is especially in Nevada, because Nevada has the highest government-owned land, something like 70 to 80%. Oregon, it's, I think, 50% or so. What is it?
It's more, but it's
Yeah,
it's
it's certainly not 87 like Nevada. And I know that Oregon has more than we had in Washington. And what it said now is you could not come to the public grazing areas unless you did two things. You had to have your own land and you had to buy a permit. And I asked my dad one time, I said, Dad, how come there wasn't much friction, with the Basque and non-Basque in the state of Washington? He said, because most of the Basques owned their own land. So there wasn't that competition for the public lands. Your Basques coming as herders, quite often taking their salaries in ewes and then becoming kind of sheepmen themselves. But they didn't immediately become rich. So they were challenging themselves by getting by on as little costly lands as possible. And so using the Public Grazing Act, and now all of a sudden they're going shut. So it was difficult. Why so little anti-Basque prejudice? It depends on where you were. And then why ranchers and business people and lawyers rather than artists, writers, and thinkers? Well, just think about that. Okay, now you're going to, I'm going to tell you the truth now. My wife says that this is full of made-up stuff. She doesn't like it because I wrote another memoir and I talked about our smooching. She wants to censor. She wants to censor that. And she said, in this one, I quote a lot of stuff from my dad that I made up. Well, I disagree with her, but that's her point of view. So here's one of our camp wagons. Here's my dad with his 30-30 and his two dogs down here at the bottom. My dad was 19, came in 1921, came from northern Spain. And let's see, map's not going to show very much better now. I wanted to show you where the ranch is located. Okay, in this corner, Spokane, right here, Ritzville, a little town, and this road, this highway right here is the freeway between Spokane and Seattle. So you're about 60 to 70 miles from Spokane to Ritzville. We were about 20 miles out from Ritzville. Now, let me point out to you that there are 3 different Washington landscapes in this area. Do you know anything about what's called the Missoula flood? And okay, up here, post-history, almost no human beings here. It had dammed up. The water had dammed up, an ice sort of dam, not made by nature, not by human beings. It broke, and then that came down here like as a flood, took this area right here, and it took away all of the topsoil down here to the Snake, and then down to the Columbia. A lot of it also went in the Willamette, and those rascals down in the Willamette are not paying any rent on our topsoil. So right here on this side, where the flood did not come, if you know the Palouse country is one of the 3 or 4 richest wheat growing areas in the United States. When you have 100 bushels of wheat per acre in dry land with no irrigation, it is that. But when you've gone in about 100 miles, that's where the Missoula flood started, and it went about 100 miles. So then there's the third one out here, which is toward the town of Moses Lake, and that is irrigated now by Grand Coulee Dam. So there are 3 landscapes there. But the landscape that was worthless for farming was the area we were on, because the topsoil was all gone. But we could use it for grazing. So that's where we were located. Dad became a rancher about 1929. This is his home in Elgee, or Ogie, E-U-G-U-I, or just I, 20 miles north of Pamplona, about 20 miles south of the French border. But this is quote I'm going to give you is not typical Sebastian Etulain. Nonetheless, it was there. Oh, I like this area because it was close to the French border and the French girls kissed more than the Spanish girls. Well, about 2 houses up was the Catholic Church, and Dad was an altar boy in the church. So we went there. We were there 3 or 4 times in in Ogie and went into the church and said, hey, you have any information on Sebastian Etulain? Here's his birth account right here. Now, the last time we were there, if we go back to that first house, now this house on this side has been made to a hostel. So the last time we were there, just stayed in this hostel, we could look out the door or the window of our room, and it was our house. Well, and if you move another 20 miles west, you run into the town of Etulain and yours truly. And if you don't believe me, I'll take you right to the town. Not much left of the town, but there's some Etulains buried in the cemetery. So that's that picture of Dad. He's a herder in the Yakima area from about 1921 till the end of the 20s. He worked for his uncle, Uncle Martin, and he said, Uncle Martin, the dogs liked Uncle Martin, but the Basques didn't. But Uncle Martin liked Dad. Our father was kind of easy to get along with, except when he told his sons, go to work, go to work, go to work. You know your Spanish. I heard quite often, come y calla, eat and shut up. Go to work, time to go to work. He felt his three sons needed to be told that. Well, so by the 20s, the end of 20s, he and his older brother, he had two older brothers, Pedro and Juan, and his name was Sebastian. Juan and he came together on raising sheep. Dad had done more to raise the sheep and had been a herder. Uncle Juan had done lots of different things. They stayed together, and then in 1936, they felt they had too much sheep for that land, that where I showed you the ranch. And so Uncle Juan went down to, I'm sure it's in Eden, Rattlesnake Hills, just outside of Sunnyside, Washington. And so Dad becomes the sole owner, but by 49, he wants to leave. So it means that he was in that about 20 years, but a sole owner for about 15 years. Let's go back to this. My dad loved 30-30s, but he didn't like coyotes, as most sheepmen didn't. So underneath the front seat of our Chevrolet car, underneath the seat of our pickup Chevrolet, and if he could get it into the truck Chevrolet, he would go after the coyotes. And he'd go over the hood of a special car, boom, boom. And if he could just blow enough dust to scare him away, he was happy because he was not a good shot. So here, if you look out our back, there you see what's happened. The top of the soil has been taken away. And little citadels of rocks still there. And that can be grazing, but it wasn't very much because there wasn't much dirt there to be a farmer. This is what it looked like at St. Mary's when we went for the summer. We'd go up around the first part of June and stay till the 15th of October, and then run our sheep up to the mountain. My mom and dad, Mom had a sad story, non-Basque, and she got together with a guy she shouldn't have gotten together. He was a 40-year-old man with about 5 kids. She was soon pregnant with a child born. Marriage lasted less than a year. And there was a divorce between her junior and senior year. And then she lived with her folks and then went back to high school and finished high school year. And there really wasn't much of a job. She didn't have an education. So she began cooking in lambing camps and for farmers and ranchers. Dad explained it this way. Oh, I discovered Mama's cooking and I fell in love with her. So he was about 35 and she was about 23. 12 years difference. So Mom and Dad and these 3 saints over here, the boys growing up, Dan, who's still alive, he's a couple years older than I myself, and my brother Ken, who's gone. And he was the half-brother that she brought into the marriage. I'm 10 years old, we're working on a cook shack, and my cousin from Yakima says, hey, you guys, do you know Ken is not your real brother? I think I set a new record, 100-yard dash, running over to Mom. Mom, we just heard that Ken is not our real brother. How come you never told us that? And then I think Mom told a stretcher. She said, I didn't think you would be interested in that. And then I sort of realized why Mom and Dad never celebrated their marriage, because Ken was born 2 or 3 years before their marriage. So then my brother Dan and I were born soon after that marriage. We were born in 37, 38 after the marriage of 36. And Mom said she thought she had enough children with those 3 boys. And Dad said, oh, you're going to stop so quick? Because he'd come from a family of 5. Well, I don't know whether I was like raised in the sheep ranch or not, because I'm frowning here. This is after we left that Ritzville ranch. We went to Ellensburg, which is cowboy country. But we raised some sheep, but we were doing more and more cows and raising hay. So all the way through to my junior and senior year, we were there in Ellensburg. It's in the center of Washington. Ellensburg has one of the most noted nationally rodeos. They go to Pendleton, they go to Ellensburg, and then they go up to Calgary. So I played football. And do you know, I got tackled, and quite often my nose went right into the grass where the horses had left some deposit just a few weeks before that. So this is a school we went to when we were there on the ranch. Here's yours truly, and my brother Dan and brother Ken up here. So I went the first 4 years of school. Because Dan started school and I was only 5 years old. So about a week after I was 5, I started school. And I guess Mom probably said, well, Dickie ought to go just with Danny. And since my dad was chairman of the school board, maybe that opened some door, I don't know. Went there 4 years. This was the little girl we were all in love with. Had a wonderful Seventh Adventist teacher. And so I learned a lot, but some things you didn't learn. And then the 4th year that I was there, it was just 5 of us. 3 Etulain boys, hired man's son, and this poor girl had to deal with this 4 guys. So then we started going to Ritzville. It was about an hour to go to school. I want you to look at that. I think you can see this. By the way, these barbed wire fences, these posts, in this case, quite often were dug by the Etulain boys. And I remember Dad coming to get us after school, 3 o'clock. Dig post holes until 6. And go home. But here's the saddest story. One summer, the county built a new road through our ranch. And the agreement was they would give us a kind of updated road, half gravel, but sort of half paved to the ranch. So it was about 2 to 3 miles from that new road to our ranch. Our job was to build fences along. So all summer, we dug post holes, day after day after day. The end of summer, Dad gives me $1. We go to the county fair, and he says, bring back the change. Now my wife would say I made that up. It's a ranch house, sturdy cement house. That's that same place. And so I don't know of a better way to depict the kind of landscape we had. And this would be a little bit of grass when we got back from the mountains. We'd get back, as I said, around the 15th of October, but a lot of barley and oats and hay being brought in from eastern Washington, because we didn't raise any ourselves. Then a little bit of grass from March until we went to the mountains, usually in May, usually. Now, if you look carefully, got some bumlands up here, and this is a maternity ward. A little lamb is coming into existence right there. So that was our job, to take care of any bummers. Bummers usually were something like this. Maybe a mama had triplets, and if you know, the ewes have 2 spigots. So there were more lambs than she had spigots. Or sometimes the mom would die, and so we had to take care of the lambs. So the most difficult for me as a kid was to see what they did quite often to try to change a lamb who had died into another lamb for a mama who had an open spigot. They would take the skin, they would skin the dead one, put it on a live one, they called it jacketing, and then they would take it to the mama that lost the lamb. They wanted the jacket on there because the lamb would smell like her lamb. And if Mama didn't do what she was supposed to, we had little catch pins, which are about 3 times this size, and you would tie the ewe to the side of the fence until you hoped she would nurse. And then you hoped after 2 or 3 weeks that had been okay. If it didn't work and they went into the bummer area, and we always had 20 or 30, that was our kids' job, was to take care of that. And I always wondered if maybe one of the reasons why there were so many bad backs among sheep, this is probably 150 pounds sitting there on the shoulder. And it looks to me like maybe she's deceased, but I can't tell for sure. But I'm one of the reasons my dad left is his back was almost decayed at age 49. He never stopped working hard, but he couldn't do things much that included his back. That's what the ranch looked like in the 30s. We had a lot of windmills because that's where we got most of our water. And it's a pretty dry area. And when you get water, quite often it comes in one slug, and then you don't have any for quite a while. I think probably 10, 12 inches of rain would be about what we had. Can you imagine then why the Blues country they got more rain than we did, and they had that very fertile kind of soil. So they could have not much more water than we, but they had that very fertile soil. And here's the lambing area back here. Now these were 3 of the big buildings. This is a granary. And by the way, we 3 boys played baseball in front here. Our bases were cowboys. And since there are only 3 boys, how in the world are you going to put a section of it? Well, we had a pitcher and a batter, and we had a left fielder. And if you didn't hit it in the left field, no hits. And we also had a basketball hoop in here. We played some. And over here, we had interesting games in the granary, because usually in the hay barns, because usually the hay barns were bales of hay brought in from eastern Washington, especially from right south of Spokane. And we boys would do all kinds of crazy things in there, which Dad would get after us. And by the way, my posterity got celebrated quite often when I did those things, because my folks believed in that. And it happened until my older brother took away the switch from Mom when he was 14. We were free after that. But we would play games there, and kind of dangerous ones, because you put fence posts down the bottom to keep the hay from getting onto the wet or damp soil. And sometimes we'd fall off of those bales and fall down about 5 bales and hit on those posts. We were lucky we didn't injure ourselves. And how come these unwanted rascals came? And we had lots of them. And so that's why my dad used that 30-30, tell them we didn't like them. We also had a lot of badgers, and they were not friendly animals. I remember we boys trapped a badger and tried to cook it. It didn't work. And then a big thing would happen. The shearers came. And the shearers would come to our place in April. They were on their way from New Mexico and Arizona, where they would start like in February, because it was only 100 down there. And by the time they got to our place, what we hoped for is a day like this. And then we were having the shearing. And when you had naked sheep, you didn't want to have them in 20, 30 degrees weather. So we had to be very careful about that. We've got 8 to 10 that would come, and they had homemade sort of domiciles on the back of their trucks. So we didn't have trailers yet. So while they made some things that looked like trailers, but you know what we boys liked best? Girls! Because they brought lots of families with them. I don't know how they worked out schooling, because quite often they would have the kids with them. Another thing would happen, right over here would be a large wool sack. So they would gather the bundles, take them down, there would be a guy in charge of that, and throw them in that wool sack. And then he would get down there. You know what they would do? They'd grab the boss's sons and throw them down in there. And do you imagine what we smelled like coming out of there? And the ticks and bugs that were out. My mom was not a swearer, but I think she was close to swearing what we smelled like when we came out of that. The wool quite often was put on the railroad and shipped east, or we began to do some for Pendleton, because the Pendleton was buying some wool. Do you know the most fancy hotel in Spokane? The Davenport Hotel. The Davenport Hotel. This is the Washington Wool Growers. Your mom and dad right here. And right next to us are our neighbors, the Escures. Now that was their anglicized name, Escupuri. And they were from the northern province of Navarra too, not too far from where my dad came. And so they were very good friends. But they were sort of, my dad and that brothers were about the only Basque in eastern Washington. There were Basques scattered around the rest. So we were really scattered as far as any sort of Basque people. Well, for my dad, like so many Basques and sheep in general, after the Second World War, things sort of collapsed. Do you know why that might happen? Well, let me tell you. There was a lot of canned mutton sent to soldiers in the Pacific. I'm not sure they liked it, but they got it. So that meant there was a kind of market to sell mutton and lamb. That was ended at the end of the war. Plus, synthetics for wool were coming on. And Dad explained it this way. He said what the government did is it put a limit on the prices we could charge, but they didn't put a limit on the cost. So he said all those things combined, and he couldn't get Basque herders. And he believed Basque herders were created by God. So what he said is, okay, I'm going to move over. And for him, Angus cattle. We had about 1,000 head of cattle before we sold the ranch. I don't know how small, but I would guess maybe 300 or 400 rather than the 7,000 that we had before. And when we went to Ellensburg, we had cattle, sheep, and hay. Those were the three things we did there. Well, here are the four Etulains. Yours truly over here, Dad, Ken, and Dan, out in front of the motel in Moses Lake. Between my junior and senior year, they moved to Moses Lake, traded the Ellensburg ranch. And by the way, when we left the ranch, he didn't sell it. He traded it for a wheat ranch. So he traded a 10,000 acre ranch, grazing ranch, for a 3,000 acre wheat ranch. We never lived on that, but he had the same man for 30 years that ran that wheat ranch. And it did well. That did well financially. But then he said he didn't like Ellensburg. It's cold. It's cold. It's one of the few places I know where you get colded out and you can't play baseball and tennis in the spring. Because the cold winds come down off the snow column we pass, and it'll be snow up there. And you know when the wind blows off the snow mountains, it's cold. So we moved to this area. So I graduated high school here. And then I went to college, Northwest Nazarene, and I met a Dutch lady. Now, we've been married 62, 63 years, and she doesn't like this next statement, but I want you to hear it. I'm not sure she fell in love with me or with my car. And can you imagine? Another Chevrolet. Dan and I had, 3 Chevrolets before this one. And first in 1936, bingo, we lost it. Next was in 1951, it collapsed on us. And so, second year in college, we got a 1955 hardtop, and that's 1956, 57. So it's nearly a new car. Then his junior year, he thought he would go to Seattle and be a pharmacist. Went to the University of Washington, and didn't work out very well. But I have no car, and big brother Dan has our car up there. So well, Daddy, can you get me something? We go down to the Chevrolet. I see a car just like this. And I say, Mom, I'm looking at that. And Dad says, what do you want a car that doesn't have a lid to it? But as so often happened, Mom was our helper. So I got this. So I think I had this until 2 years after our marriage. So I think Joyce probably fell in love with this more than me. Well, I left there and taught then after getting a master's and doctorate. And I taught at my alma mater at Northwest Nazarene 2 years, went on the East Coast 2 years. Then I had a feeling that I had gone too much right back to the womb. You know, I'd gone off, I was a product of that evangelical background. I'd come right back to that. I wasn't unhappy. I love the place. I still do. In 2 weeks, I'll be there to give this talk there. But I wanted to experience something else. And plus, I wanted to research and write. Now, if you don't know this, let me explain to you what happens to colleges. I asked a guy who was teaching at Northwest Nazarene, how many courses do you teach each semester? He said, 4 or 5. Earlier this week, I was at Idaho State, where I used to teach. I said, how many did you teach? 3. I taught 2 at the University of New Mexico. But 40% of any sort of salary raise you would get was based on research and publication. 40% on teaching and 40% on research and publication. That doesn't add up to 100%. The other 20%, how were you involved in the academic community and in the community at large? So that meant if I wanted to research and write, there wouldn't be time at Northwest Nazarene, less time, and there wasn't any graduate program at Idaho State. So immigration historians talk about push and pull. So I felt a little bit pushed out of where I was and pulled to something that would be closer. So I went to Albuquerque and was there 22 years. So here I am out front. You can see the Pueblo architecture of the history building there. Well, we went back to the old country sometimes. Here's my pretty Dutch wife. Here are my Basque relatives, and they were on the French side. They had left during the Civil War and gone to the French side. And all the younger ones who came to the United States came from France, rather than my uncles and dad who came from the Spanish side. And we had a few get-togethers here. This is my 2 cousins. This gal here, she's a musician. And this lady is a librarian. They're my cousins in Washington. And here's my librarian wife. And this chubby guy here with the great onset, yours truly. So we did some connection in the old country, and we did some here. So for me, my life as a Basque was on that Basque ranch. There's Dad and Dara and that hard work. But my Basque identity came later, and it has continued to the present. So that's Boyhood Among the Woolies. Thank you very much. All right, now who's got the first question? Yes, sir.
Are all these books still in print?
Yes, they are. They're all in print. I'm just going to say, I guess I already told you, sort of, you define yourself. If you're really interested in reading a smoothly written book that is for the general public, more than for academics, read Sweet Promised Land, Robert Laxalt. It's a wonderful book. It's a marriage of fiction and history, or biography. And he was a great writer. He had journalism background. I've always thought if my academic history college had had a year of journalism, I think they would have been better writers, because the journalists learn how to write for the general public. And a lot of academics do not, because when we go through master's and doctoral programs, you know, when we take a job, no matter where it is, you have to please your colleagues, and almost always you have to be a superb, good teacher. But if you're at a state university, you have to be a researcher and writer too. So after I had reached the top of assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, the 3 steps. You might have started an instructor if you didn't have a doctor's degree. But by the time you got to the top, usually after 20 years. So I said to myself, I want to write for the general public. And there was no question I wanted a little bit wider audience. I wanted to write books that my wife would like, or my daughter, librarian daughter, would like. I don't know whether they're reading them or not, but so for me, when you look at that Laxalt book, that's a Laxalt book that I, as a scholar, can like, but it's also a book that you could like as a general person. Yeah. I see. I better answer that. I just read a week before it came over the Beater book. That's the best book on Idaho Basque. And I talked to you about the Douglas Papao. I talked to you about Geronima Echeverria. And I talked to you about the book that she and I did together. And then my Boyhood of the Woolies is over there. And then I did this collection, Basque in Northwest. That's not in print. That's sold out, and that's not good. And Robert Blackshall's Sweet Promised Land. The second book by Gloria Tortorica Buena is not as good as the Beavers, but it's a good book. She does a lot on the dancing and celebrations of the Boise Basque. And then talking about Zuberi's book. Yeah. So if you're a devoted general reader, the two books I would suggest to you are Zuberia and Sweet Promised Land. And I think you enjoy those. Those will keep you awake at night. You know, we academics might put you to sleep. Now, who's got the next question? Don't tell me you have no questions. Yes, ma'am.
Was there competition between the Irish herders and the Basque? Did you have any Irish?
I was talking to this gentleman here, and I said, the problem is, not only do we not have all the books on the Basque we ought to have, for example, we ought to have enough data done this in Bilbao. After 50 years, we ought to have it. There are no comparisons. And so, you know, when you say this is what a Basque is, well, how's that compared to the Greeks? How's that compared to the Scots? How's it like other sheepherds? We don't have those books. And we should have those. So if somebody still wants to do the sheepherder era, they ought to really take another group and make some comparison. And since they were mainly sheepherders among the Basques, take maybe another group that was very much involved in sheepherder and make a comparison. Here is also another subject. If most of the Basques leave the sheep ranch in the 1950s, and most did, there are almost no Basques on the sheepherder, all sheepherder ranch after about 1970. That means half of the time period, from 1900 to 2020s, they were off the sheep ranch. Or where have they gone? What have they done?
Here they went to construction and to the sawmill.
Yeah.
Did they not go to college?
Well, I'm maybe the next generation.
Well,
yeah.
that's what I'm talking about.
Right,
After all this, maybe about 3 or 4 generations.
These herders.
I know about Heinz and all that stuff.
These
Yeah.
herders learned they could do a lot better.
Yeah.
You know,
But
than
again,
that.
you're still sticking to that first years.
Yeah.
And probably the transitions you're talking about were happening by the 60s and 70s. I want you to go all the way to the 2020s. And it's going to have a lot to do. For example, in our family, all 6 of the kids are college graduates, 2 with doctorates, 2 with master's degrees. Now, that may be higher than the average, but when I did the Basque in the state of Washington, all my cousins are college graduates. And so that's just in the Etulain family, small group. Man, college made the difference of what they did occupationally. So there's so much left to be done, both chronologically and comparisons, both of them. Yeah. I remember the first years I came through, I think Heinz was still booming. When would you remember the Heinz sheds? Yeah, it was still booming then when I came. And I remember that later going, it was like a ghost town over there. Yeah. But I knew that there were a lot of Basques that made that transition. Jobs. And that's
Food on the table.
Huh?
I said food on the table.
Yeah, that's right. Herders in the 1920s, I don't have the salaries after the 1920s. Herders in the 1920s made about $40 a month. Yeah. It got better than that. I think we were paying $150 or so by the middle 40s or so. But my dad and you did have difficulty getting good American herders because there was a psychology of it. Sheepmen were seen as less than cowboys, and most ranchers. Unwritten, but just sort of there. Plus, the pay was less than most other work, so you just could not. Most of the guys we had were people that didn't work very well otherwise, and they drank too much. So it was very difficult for Dad to get the herders. Not only because he thought that the Basques were better, but the ones that he was able to get, it was difficult. And you know, if a person feels sort of lonesome out there on the sheep, and they have that sort of feeling, it's hard to keep them out there month after month. So for me, as a guy who likes to scribble, there are many projects to be done. Biographies, the post-sheep herder era, comparisons, and a lot of stories. And I'll end with this. My father had these two statements, and they really have been meaningful to me. I will tell you ahead of time, my wife says I made them up. Not true. No S for dot. No, right? Get her done. Get her done. And I guess I'll have to outwork him. He rises with no money, having borrowed $500 from his brother, no education. Well, he had 3 or 4 years of education. And just booted out with the sheep. Okay, now, how did son react? Well, I went to a small church-related college. I finished the University of Oregon. University of Oregon is just another state university. It's not up or down. It's just typical. It's not a Berkeley. And it's not a Harvard or a Yale. So I enter the history departments, and all of a sudden, I'm introduced to a colleague. Glad to meet you. Got your where? PhD. Yale. Glad to meet you. Where did you get your PhD? Berkeley. And those guys would have looked at Northwest Nazarene as Jesus Tech. So, that second statement of my dad, I guess I'll have to outwork it. It really got into my reach. So, in 85, and I've written 65 books, I think that's probably the motivating factor. Maybe I was a little sheepish about that. Okay, thanks very much.